Join us to get exclusive and rare access to some of the industry's best leaders. Leaders who will share all their secrets to success with you. Leaders who have closed thousands of successful deals between them, generating hundreds of billions of dollars. And leaders giving you the roadmap to fast track your career and reach the highest echelons of the business. So welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast and best of luck on your growth journey. We have another top guest for you all today. I'm super excited to be joined by Alex Chenesseau, Managing Director at CMD Global Partners in New York. Alex is a seasoned investment banking professional with extensive experience in delivering bespoke M&A and capital solutions to businesses in the consumer and TMT spaces. Alex is passionate about foreign affairs and international negotiations, which has been the foundation really for his highly successful career in banking. He brings a unique perspective to the show, having spent 12 plus years living in Asia, has worked on 3 continents, Europe, US and Asia, including for 6 years working in China. So a really diverse journey. Alex started his career at Lazard back in 2009, where he climbed the ranks to VP level across his 10 years with the firm. But during that time, he worked in Paris, Beijing, and New York. And from 2011 to 2015, Alex moved to Beijing with a partner from the Paris office and was the founding member of Lazard's new Greater China cross-border advisory group, which had offices in Beijing and Hong Kong. This period was historically the most active for Chinese cross-border M&A and investments, including with the US and European markets. So super exciting time for Alex and the team. Alex was promoted to MD at Evercore, where he joined in New York in 2018. He worked in the M&A advisory group, where he led a team in New York working on cross-border transactions across the entire of the Asia region, and mainly in the TMT and consumer sectors. Alex recently joined CMD Global Partners in April of 2024, where he took a managing director role in New York, and where his responsibility is for leading the firm's technology and media M&A advisory group. It's exciting times for Alex and the CMD team as they look to execute their ambitious growth plans. So if that wasn't enough, Alex also serves as a team member at the Council on Foreign Relations and was recognized as a young leader by the Asia Society, Aspen Institute, and French American Foundation, nonetheless. So Alex is super passionate about volunteering, international business, building diverse and global networks, and growing new ventures. So I'm just super excited to get into the discussion with him today. So welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast, Alex, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Why don't we jump in and you introduce CMD Global Partners and what you do for your clients?
Sure. CMD Global Partners is a boutique investment bank. We're based in Chicago. The firm was actually founded by former colleagues of mine, so we intersected over a decade ago. And we primarily focus on M&A advisory. I would say primarily in the middle market and lower middle market. Most of us have come from larger banks, and we like to bring that expertise and global approach to how we serve clients to that middle market. And we do work on some capital raising and some restructuring transactions, but we're primarily advisory focused in the M&A market.
Love that. And I guess that network being put to use, right? Lazard contacts from 10 years ago, and now obviously you are working closely together at CMD. Love that. And why don't you tell the listeners something interesting or unknown about you before we get into the meat of today's discussion?
Maybe something different. I'm advanced Scuba certified recently. It's been on my bucket list for such a long time, and just last year was finally able to do it. So I love spending time in the water. I love sharks. One of the things on my bucket list is to dive with great white sharks outside of a cage. I still have to negotiate with my wife on that one, but I'd love to do one at some point.
Wow, outside the cage is really for the fear, right? Love that. Yeah, I learned to dive in Thailand and did a fair amount of diving on the Great Barrier Reef, so understand the love for water. And I remember doing a dive on the Great Barrier Reef, and they said there will be sharks down there. They're not dangerous, but we're going to just remind you because natural reaction when you see one is to freak out a little bit. And they weren't wrong. Let's get into today's discussion. I'm super interested to learn about your time, obviously working in Asia. It's unusual, one of the guests we've had on. So how did you end up working in China for 5-6 years?
This is a good question. It was certainly not part of the initial plan. So I actually spent some time in Asia when I was younger in the 90s. I lived in Singapore. We traveled extensively in Southeast Asia when I was younger. And during my studies, I took a gap year and I worked in Shanghai. And that was right before the International Expo back in 2008. And it was such an exciting time to be in China. The country was opening up, building up. I started my career at Lazard in Paris, and a couple years into that experience, the firm actually decided to really build out its China practice. So I moved there with a partner from the Paris office without really knowing how much time I was going to spend there. But I was just really excited about going to a market that was booming, opening up, and where there was so much to learn.
Love that. So a bit of interest there from traveling and being able to take part in that exciting new challenge were big drivers.
It was certainly not a typical M&A career path at the time.
I can imagine, especially as you say, it was a growing market. How did you make the transition successfully and thrive over there?
I got my training at Lazard in Paris, and moving to China, certainly being part of the same firm helped me still. I had a foundation for how to work as an analyst and associate, but there was a lot to learn in Beijing. A lot of companies I'd never heard of, a very different market. We were focused on cross-border transactions over there, so there was always a Chinese counterpart and a foreign counterpart. I had to personally learn about the whole regulatory landscape and how to get deals done. And I also strive to develop a network already at my level by meeting a lot of people there, getting involved in different initiatives locally, different social groups, and a lot of work. But through that work, I really got to learn a lot of things about different sectors, different companies, and develop a lot of personal relationships with my colleagues and clients.
Yeah, it makes sense. And we'll definitely jump into that network part. And it must have been a real challenge, as you say, despite having that grounding in Lazard to then rebuild from the ground up. Let's dump into some of those learnings. What did you learn from working in China?
I think there's a couple things. I think one is it was an extremely competitive market. A lot of banks competing for business. Paradoxically, it's a huge economy, but the M&A market per se, the traditional M&A market as we know it that banks compete for, was not necessarily very big compared to the US and some of these other markets. So it was extremely competitive. Resilience, I think, was something that was critical. We're working on transactions and regulatory environments that were evolving. As I said, there was always an international party, a Chinese party. So there was a whole dimension of cultural elements that came into play, different time zones. So a lot of transactions that we worked on worked out. A lot didn't work out. As a junior analyst and associate, you have to hang in there, working long hours. But certainly the opportunity to really learn so much about a new market, I think, was really one thing. The other thing I would say is probably developing long-term relationships. It's a market where I quickly learned that you have to collaborate with people. You have to develop partnerships. I was not Chinese, and being there, working there, I had to really develop friendships and all sorts of partnerships with my colleagues, clients, to really be able to do my job, in addition to just all the typical investment banking toolkit that you can learn anywhere. And I would say it's really learning how to adapt to the local market. Maybe the last point is creativity. It was a fairly new and nascent M&A market compared to Europe and North America. And because of a lot of inherent complexities around cross-border deals and the evolving environment over there, a lot of deals, you had to be creative in terms of getting them structured, negotiating them, etc. So really thinking outside of the box constantly. And as a banker, we had to get more involved on all the structuring and legal elements, obviously working with lawyers, but I think that's something that for me was quite different over there relative to the US or Europe, where you usually leave that work to the lawyers. But in China, you really have to take a more wholesome approach to how to get it.
So much more of a bird's eye view. So competitive market, the resilience, being aware of all that regulatory change that's going on, developing those relationships and collaborating on those partnerships was obviously key. And creativity, which comes up again and again for guests. I think it's a key part of investment banking that often isn't spoken about, which is really key to success. So that's a great list of skills and learnings. Do you have an edge over advisors because of this experience that you're competing against in the US or on European deals if they're cross-border?
When I moved to New York with Lazard as a VP, there was certainly a lot of things I had to learn working on typical public M&A transactions in the US. I had worked with some US publicly traded companies while I was in Europe and Asia, but there were a lot of types of transactions that I hadn't worked on. I would say that was new to me. It was a great learning experience at Lazard. The edge, I would say, is really around having worked in different geographies and having developed a local network. So today, if a client comes to me and says that they're looking at something in China, or they're looking at something in South America, or they're even looking something in Africa, where I also worked on some transactions. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I can certainly go to trusted relationships, and I know how to think about the approach, or at least the questions we should be asking ourselves, right? Because of all the kind of broader emerging markets work I've done, I'm not afraid of something happening on the other side of the world. It's not necessarily completely out of my comfort zone, and that's probably something I've learned in China, where you had to be extremely entrepreneurial. And I think that's when I moved to the US, I realized that at a VP, I had probably had more exposure to certain types of transactions and having to take ownership of certain client relationships or certain situations in a way that maybe if I had only worked at a very large bank in a very large office my entire career up until then, I would have not necessarily had that exposure. So stress tested early on, I'll put it that way.
Stress test. Yeah, I like that. In at the deep end. And it makes sense. We always talk about investment banking as an apprenticeship and you're having to do the reps to get to the higher levels of the business. So I can understand having so many reps or more exposure at a younger age within your career must have really helped you and made you more rounded. And you touched on network. And again, that makes sense, having that diverse network. I know you shared with me in our discussions that you feel your diverse network has been a key driver for your success. What I'd like to know more about is how did you go about building it? What are the keys there?
I've always liked volunteering, really doing something on the side that compared to your day-to-day work as a student or working in a company. I probably started volunteering in high school when I was given to underprivileged children. I still remember history and math classes, but that was on a Wednesday afternoon every week. It got me out of my boarding school at the time, and it was just going out there into the town and really meeting people and developing those relationships. In the years that followed, I've always had an interest in global issues, and I've gotten involved with a couple nonprofits, one in Africa. The organization was based in Paris, but we did a lot of work in Africa. And then over time, given my interest in foreign affairs and international relationships, I just got involved in different organizations. When I was in China with some friends, we founded a very small think tank where we invited speakers to talk about the economy and what was going on in China in their industry. When I moved to New York, which is such an incredible place, there are so many incredible organizations based here, I naturally got to know a lot of people involved in some of these organizations that I'm part of today. And I feel that throughout my career, those involvements have helped me meet people that I would have not necessarily met in my day-to-day at work or at university. The people you meet in those organizations have a different job. They're not people you talk to every day, but you make really good friends because you have a shared purpose and you're trying to build something, right? And so I've always really enjoyed being part of organizations that have a common goal, a shared purpose. And as you develop those relationships very authentically, you get to meet incredible people. And I've learned so much from people I've met through these organizations. And a lot of my very good friends today are people I've met through involvements outside of my day-to-day.
That's a really interesting take. I obviously hear a lot about networking when I'm interviewing senior leaders, but the volunteering angle comes up, but I don't think as strongly as it has played a part for you in your network. And I love the way that you've been able to help and support important initiatives. And that's also had a really good impact on your network and growth. So super exciting. And I can understand why having a shared purpose really binds you and creates something that's much more stable. You mentioned the affiliations that you have, such as the French American Foundation, the Asia Society, the Council of Foreign Affairs, Aspen Institute. Have these played a particular role in your growth other than the network piece we just talked about?
I would say they certainly have, in terms of providing opportunity that I wouldn't have elsewhere. Take an example, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a New York-based think tank, which was founded over 100 years ago after the First World War. It primarily focused on international affairs, especially from a U.S. perspective. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in Saudi Arabia with 15 members, including myself. For a week, we were able to meet a great number of business leaders, members of the government, different types of leaders in Saudi Arabia. And that happens coincidentally just a few weeks after the US election. And we all know what's going on in the Middle East right now. So being able to go on a trip like that with some policy experts and members with very diverse backgrounds was an incredible learning experience. And I I would not be able to go to Saudi Arabia and just set up all those meetings on my own. So when you're part of an organization with people who share your interests, you just learn and grow. I'll put it that way, in a way that's really accelerated, and it gives you opportunity that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily have just by doing things on your own.
Thanks for sharing that example. That really helps me connect, and powerful stuff. Definitely giving me something to think about and more around organizations I should be looking towards to help me grow and my network grow too. So thanks for sharing. We talked to relationship building as well. We already touched on that as part of the networking, but I know it's played a big role when you talked about your time in China and how you had to build really great relationships, both with internal team members and clients. Any tips for us on how you build relationships effectively?
I feel like I have so much to learn still on that. I would say the foundation of networking is probably you have to like going out there, meeting people, learning from people, and wanting to get involved with people. That's really the foundation. And it has to be authentic. You have to enjoy it, because if you don't like going out there and meeting new people, it's going to be very hard to be effective networking. I've always enjoyed meeting entrepreneurs, meeting people who are building things, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's NGOs. I've always really enjoyed being in that type of environment. That's the foundation. The second thing is, and I've certainly over the years learned more about that, is how to think about adding value to people, right? That means you need to be able to listen and really understand what somebody is trying to achieve at a given moment. And especially when you're thinking about working with a client or trying to win over a client, what is that person trying to achieve within the organization, within their market? It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be able to add value immediately today in a very grandiose way, but you need to understand the trajectory of that person, or think about over time how you can develop a relationship by being a supporting factor in that person's growth and journey. From developing relationships with students, to developing relationships with alumni, to developing relationships with clients, your colleagues, how can you add value to people? How can you be a partner in those people's growth and development? And that's what I try to tell myself every day, both in the business world, but also in personal relationships. I want to be there to as much as I can in people's lives when they need it and when they want me to be there.
Your authenticity really comes across in this area. I know from our meetings, I really felt that, and couldn't agree more about learning. If you enjoy it, if that's part of what you enjoy, it makes it, of course, a lot easier. And adding value, listening, really understanding what someone's looking to achieve. And I think it's a great point you mentioned about it might not be something you can add value right now, but that's part of the process. That's really rings true as well. So thanks for sharing your experience there.
Pete, I'll say one thing on that. The biggest mistake we make in networking is I need the immediate gain, or I need to gain in 3 to 6 months, or I'm looking for a job, and so I need to go run around, meet all these different. That's certainly true when you're trying to achieve something, when you're looking for a job, when you're doing these things. But the most powerful relationships are relationships you've built over 20 years, right? And so it starts early, and having that long-term approach and that more authentic approach in how you engage with people and you engage with your network is really important.
Couldn't agree more. Don't rush it. And again, it comes back to being authentic, right? If you're just out to get something, it's not going to build that relationship that is really meaningful. So I couldn't agree more. And you touched there, I guess mentorship is part of that as well, right? And we know it's so critical for success in the industry. And leaders tell me all the time, if I'd done one thing earlier in my career, it would have been get a mentor earlier or look for a mentor earlier. So keen to get your take on that. First of all, has it played a key part in your growth and your career path? And if so, why?
I've always craved for feedback and mentorship over the years. As you said, looking back, I could have probably even sought more mentorship at certain moments. But I think mentors have always played a role, because, like you said, they give you a experience. They said 10 years ago, I did that. It didn't work out at all. Make sure you think about that. So little pointers that can sometimes really go a long way. And then the other point is really about that human relationship. There's moments in our careers, in our lives, where we have really important decisions to make, and where frankly we feel that we need support, or we just need a sounding board. And I think going out there and seeking feedback and seeking to talk with somebody acting as a sounding board is actually a sign of maturity, or even wisdom in certain moments. And the more you advance in your careers, the more you're going to have important decisions to make and complex decisions to make. And you want to be able to have the ability to go to close advisors, close personal advisors, to help you navigate some of these questions. Mentorship is absolutely critical at every stage of a career. There's not that age where that's it, I'm done, no need for mentors anymore. I still crave mentorship today, especially as we build our firm. It's really keeping that mindset that going out there and seeking advice and help is actually a sign of strength to some extent.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more again. And I've had mentor relationships that have given me so much and helped me grow. And if you can get the ones where there's real radical candor and you're able to get into topics, and they can be so powerful for your growth too, right? Especially in the short and long term. So love that take. And I guess whilst we're on the kind of mentorship career path, I remember when we were speaking, you're super passionate about taking control of your career, not letting it pass you by. So how do you manage your career strategically?
I would love to hear more tips about that. I get questions sometimes about my career so far, and having worked in 3 different continents. And frankly, I'm very excited about what I've done so far. Did I plan that ahead of time 15 years ago? Absolutely not. If you would have told me 15 years ago that I would have done all of this, I would not believe you. More importantly, I come from a family that there were no bankers, no financiers in my family. I even surprised people when I went into investment banking. I just loved my internship at Lazard in Paris and met great people there. Sometimes you have to be opportunistic with life, and you have to let life create these opportunities. And especially in today's world where industries are shifting so fast and where new companies are rising so quickly, and you have to be able to not be too rigid in terms of how you plan your life. Even the investment banking industry, to some extent, and the financial industry is evolving very quickly. We need to follow trends to some extent. With that being said, you do want some level of direction. You want to have a certain direction in how you want to lead your life. We're going to spend a significant chunk of time working in an office or whatever we do it in a professional capacity. We're going to spend a significant amount of time working in a job, and we want that job to be fulfilling. And so when we think about what we want to be doing with that time, we need a certain set of principles and, I would say, longer term goals that we want to pursue. In my case, I always knew I wanted to do something international. My mother is Cuban American, my father is French, grew up in Asia. I knew that for me, what was fulfilling was to be in an environment where there were different cultures, where we could be at the intersection of different countries, etc. So that was something that was very important to me. I didn't know that it was going to translate into working in investment banking in 3 different continents, but to some extent, that's how it happened. And then I've always loved the element of negotiations and then building companies. I've always been very interested in entrepreneurs. I don't think I'm a pure entrepreneur myself, but I've always really loved being around these people building things. When I look back at the 15 years, those are big elements that were behind the scenes in terms of helping me make decisions along the way.
You make some really good points there. There's a lot to take away from that in terms of having that direction, having those base areas that make you happy, such as you mentioned, international, building companies, around entrepreneurs, negotiation. You knew those were the blocks and you wanted to build upon, but then being flexible, following the trends, looking out for opportunities. And I guess where we are today in investment banking, we've talked about coming out of quite a tough period. And every time I ask leaders about what it was like to come out of a financial crisis or what it was like to come out of COVID, they say the same thing: tough. But there are a lot of opportunities out of that, and you've got to look out for the learnings and take advantage of those opportunities. So I guess it resonates really true today. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to talk a bit more about your cross-border expertise, given that's really an area of strength for you. What does it take to be really successful in cross-border transactions?
There's certainly a lot of elements that are similar to working on any transaction in the investment banking space, or M&A more precisely. But I would say, and that goes back to my time in China, where I initially learned that, you need to be creative. I think there's a lot of situations where a certain type of deal between 2 countries has never happened before. And whether it's because the industry is specific, whether it's because one of the counterparties is doing a cross-border deal for the first time. And so being creative and really not just coming in with a playbook and saying, this is how we do it, but really understand, okay, what on each side, what are the potential roadblocks? How do we navigate those? And I'll give you an example. I was working on a transaction between a European company and a Chinese company in the entertainment space, right? Years back. The Chinese group had never really made an overseas investment before.
Okay.
And the business that they were investing in Europe didn't really exist in China at the time. So that the European partner was going to bring that concept to China. And so you had a market that was not proven yet. You had an investor slash buyer who had never really operated a business like that. And by the way, they were going to partner with a European company that they had just met a year before. So a lot of unknowns. That was quite unconventional. I had to spend a lot of time with the Chinese buyer to help them build out their model and really help them internally on their side, educate them on the business concept, where our client was actually on the European side. So very unconventional. You would never do that in the US, for better or for worse. I think knowing how to get a deal done, you have to sometimes be thinking and operating outside of the usual way of doing things.
I can see why now. You mentioned at the start when we're talking about your experience abroad, challenging, you need to be creative. I think that example is a great, it really sums it up. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, I want to move into leadership. This is an investment banking leadership podcast, and you are a leader and a top leader. So I really want to pick your brain in some of those areas. Why don't we start with what skills do you need to build a great investment banking leader, in your opinion?
We probably touched upon it, but developing really personal and authentic relationships with people. Being a good advisor, one of the foundational elements is really trust. People will come to you because they trust you, not because you have all the answers, but because they trust that you will help them navigate the question and get them to a point where they will make the decision. You're an advisor, you're not making the decision for your client. So that's the important piece. And that is a skill that takes a long time to develop in a professional context. So being able to develop those personal relationships with people, and then it's being able to develop personal relationships with a very broad set of people. And I always encourage relationships with different levels within an organization. I'll take an example. I had the honor of spending a day with Vernon Jordan, who used to be a senior advisor at Lazard, was a civil rights activist for many years. And when I was at Lazard, we traveled to Atlanta, his home state, to meet one of his relationships. And as we walked into the company, he knew a lot of the board members. But as we walked into the company, I could see that either him directly or because he has a friend or somebody on the board who said, you should meet that person. As soon as we walked into the office, he was so at ease and connected walking in the hallway. And when we were flying back that day to New York, we were in the airport lounge and he was around chatting with people and you could, and he was such an incredible figure. Having that ability to be so connected with people, humble, being interested in people's lives and what they're doing, I think is so important. It takes a skill because in an industry where we're so busy, where there's always a lot going on, where there's a lot of stress, being able to extract ourselves and our character to be able to always certainly, as much as we can, develop those relationships and have those interactions with people is critical. That's really the first thing. A couple other things. I think technical knowledge goes without saying. You know, as you evolve in your career in investment banking, you don't necessarily need to be the one doing all the technical analysis yourself, but you have to have the ability to do it. And you need to be able to get into the weeds in topics in a very granular way. I personally never believed in the coverage banker model. I think if you're in a different business, that's a different discussion. But if you're an advisor on transactions, you need to be able to get really into the weeds on things and be very hands-on. So I think that's very important. And then maybe two other points. One is business selection. Where are you and your team spending your time? And you should think about your team as you. We're the same unit. If you personally don't want to spend time on a specific topic, you should never be requiring anybody else to spend a lot of time on that topic. Thinking about where you allocate time and resources. And then the last point is, and we often lose track of that in the financial industry, is thinking big picture. What are we trying to build, right? I certainly credit a lot of that to my time at Lazard and Evercore. At different points in my career in those firms, I was in a place where we had to build a new team. We were building a new office. We were building, and I love that, right? It goes back to the point around entrepreneurship. And so I felt I was part of something bigger. I was really putting all those hours into not just making a paycheck and trying to get a bonus at the end of the year, but we were really trying to build something. And today at CMD Global, we're about 20 people today, and we certainly plan to grow. And I think it's we all feel that we're building an organization together. And I think that is really important in leadership is people need to understand and feel and trust that you're building something bigger that goes beyond yourself. You're not just trying to maximize the benefits just for yourself. You can't build an organization that way. Those are probably some of the things that really come to mind when you ask me that question.
That's great. So much to unpack. And the last point about big picture and building something special, feeling you're part of something bigger than yourself is key. I really agree with that. And I aspire to that in Altrum and how I go about my business. But I love that. And where you spend your time, that comes up a lot and I get it. But I like your take on if you're not going to spend time there, where's your team? That's an interesting take on it that I've not really heard before. And again, authentic relationships, building that trust, spending time, having the interactions. I know you're a big fan of empathy and the role that plays. So I just want to maybe sit there a bit on how important empathy within the team has been for you. And if you have any tips for leaders on how to build that skill set.
It probably goes back to personal relationships. I think when you have an authentic relationship with somebody, to some extent you show empathy, right? Mm-hmm. If they're going through a difficult time. Certainly in our family, in our personal lives, that goes without saying. Our friendships, our family members, we have a very personal, emotional connection with those people. And I think in the professional context, there's a little bit of that, right? My best clients, some of them are friends, and I would say I'm not saying all your clients need to be your friends, but there needs to be some level of connection with them. And as we're competing with a lot of different things at the same time in our job, we need to remember that our clients in this job come first. And there's certain times when they'll need your help for something, and it may not be a big deal at that specific moment, but to know how to be involved and appreciate some difficult moments or situations where they just need advice and they just need to navigate something, and you need to be present. And so trying to be present when it matters. To some extent, that is how I would define the need for empathy. How do you develop that? I still have so much to learn on that. But what I try to tell myself, it's always listening, which I don't always do very well, by the way. But it's trying to always listen and be there and really understand when it matters. Because they're not always going to be there saying, I really need it for you to do this. Sometimes you just need to know how to jump in and get involved and be that support when you need to. And that comes from listening and empathizing with the situation that the person's in or the client's in.
It makes sense, right? Just listening out for that and trying to read the cues and build that relationship so you understand when the arm around the shoulders needed, I guess, on both sides. So yeah, like that. And what about recognition? It feels to me like investment banking gets a tough rap for recognition within the industry because it's so demanding and fast paced. How do you recognize success within your teams?
It's a combination of two things. One is probably in any business, you need tangible KPIs, you need data, right? So sure. There's no doubt about it. In our business, it comes to the number of deals that you're working on, that you're able to close, mandates, revenue. I would say all the usual things to run any successful organization. And you need to be very consistent and track that, right? And when you think about allocating resources, you need to be able to allocate resources where it matters to really lead that growth. So that's, I would say, nothing new there. The other piece is it's a bit more qualitative to some extent, but especially if you're building a new organization, a new team, and even then, even I would say in a more mature organization or more mature team, personally, one of the signs of success is if you feel that there is a culture that is moving the team or the organization forward and where there is the ability to take on new projects, bigger projects, more ambition, grow into new businesses, grow into new verticals, and frankly, attract. If people want to come and work in your team and work in your organization, that's a sign of success. That means that something's working there, especially for us as we think of continuing to build out our firm. A sign of success is people wanting to come and be part of the journey and want to be involved and feel that they have ownership in the future of our firm. that's a sign of success. And it's frankly very hard to develop and maintain because it requires very consistent processes in terms of how to drive change and development. And it takes a lot of personal involvement and skill and relationship building. Those two prongs are absolutely critical in building a successful organization, and certainly building a successful organization in an industry like investment banking that requires a ton of high-end, very top human capital.
For sure. Again, that bigger picture part comes back, I think, again, there with the culture and people wanting to be part of it. So, yeah, thanks for sharing. Let's just talk a little bit about the opportunities and the challenges. We're recording this at the end of 2024. We're moving into 2025. It's been a bumpy 18 months, I think it's fair to say, for most of us in the industry. As a leader, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for next year? And what do you see as the biggest challenges for leaders as well next year?
There's one thing is that I started my career in 2009, and it was a very specific moment in history where
Another bumpy year.
you, you can only see the ceiling from there. I'll put it that way. There was a ceiling, but like you said, Pete, the last several years have been very challenging in the industry, and I would even say 2021 was a record year in the industry in many ways. But even then, that was challenging. We were in the middle of COVID. People were starting their careers working behind Zoom. Do we want to go back to something like that? Absolutely not. I wouldn't wish that for anybody. To some extent, it's been a while, right? Our industry has been a smooth momentum, if that ever exists in our industry. Heading into 2025, I think there's a lot of momentum. I think a lot of investors have held back on investing. There's a lot of undeployed capital in the private equity space. I think that coming out of the '08 crisis, a lot of smaller firms were growing. All the independent firms, the Lazards, Evercores, et cetera, were being more valued for their independent advice. I do think that now we're moving into a space which requires even more specialization in certain ways, whether it's an industry, where it's a certain type of product or transaction. And so I think there's a lot of new firms to build. And then you think about AI, which we've talked about before in the past. How do we, as a firm, use AI to enhance the working experience of our colleagues and also the ability to deliver high quality work and advice to clients? And so there's a lot of new things at play right now. So I personally, somebody who loves thinking about building business, I find that very exciting. Right? We are moving into a new space where there's a lot of new tools coming up. There is certainly a market that's coming back from a transaction perspective, and there's really new industries emerging from the last couple of years and post-COVID. It's a very exciting time. I think across the street, people are somewhat confident about next year and the next couple of years. Obviously, the world is where it is today, very fragmented, lots of complexity. But at the same time, we feel it day to day. That's where a lot of our relationships and clients need advice on that. So being able to step in and help companies navigate a more complex world that we live in today is part of what we should be doing and thinking about, and why I personally love spending my time too.
Amazing. Your passion, your enthusiasm for the challenge and the ability to capture the opportunities from the challenge really comes through. And I'm wired that way, so I definitely see it. And I like your hopefulness around the market returning to a bit more stability, whatever that may be, because I've been in the business 14 years. And as you say, it's been an unusual 3 or 4 years for sure. So lots of excitement there. And as you mentioned, AI, without doubt, is going to continue to impact in ways, right? So whoever can harness that is going to be moving forward a lot quicker. Before I jump into the wrap, I can't believe we've been together already 40, 50 minutes. Just want to say, we talked about mentorship, we talked about network and relationships, but is there anything else that's really helped you grow and develop as a leader?
I would say making a lot of mistakes and working on a lot of projects that I would never want to get involved with again.
The scars.
The scars of battle. Look, there's no way around it. And this probably goes beyond just our industry. You have to be on the court. I had done this leadership program that had the concept of being on the court versus being in the sidelines and in the stands. From the stands, you can have a great view on things, and you can do all the commenting, strategy, and who should be doing what, etc. And you certainly need a bit of that. But at the end of the day, it's the people who are on the court who are moving the game forward. And so being on the court, taking risks, making mistakes, never make the same mistake twice, learn from your mistakes. And we talked about seeking guidance on how to really make the best of a specific situation or experience. It's really just not being afraid to be out there and speaking up. Something I've worked on for a very long time, and there's probably still more work there, is knowing how to really speak up and really express your opinion at the right time. Don't delay certain conversations. Don't delay certain decision makings. Think ahead. Constantly, we can't guess what the future is, but we have to be thinking about, what if this happens? What if that happens? How do we address that? And in our job, there's certain things that you can't control, but there's actually a lot more things that we can control in banking that we think we don't, right? It's really making sure that we are on the court and we're really trying to anticipate what can happen to the best of our ability.
I like the analogy of being on the court, and I think you've got to learn from the reps, as we've already talked about. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. What about on the book side? I'm a big believer that leaders are readers, and might not be just books these days with podcasts and all the other materials out there. But is there any materials that you recommend to the audience that have had a big impact on you in your career?
I would say philosophy in general is such a great way to shape our mind and shape our approach to things. When my philosophy professors would tell me that 20 years ago, I didn't believe them. But looking back, okay, yeah, you probably were right.
Hindsight from that period as a youth, right?
Yeah. So I think that certainly we all need some sort of philosophy and books that where we come out where we feel that we went through an intellectual journey. But I probably in bringing everything back together from our conversation, one book is probably How Will You Measure Your Life by Clay Christensen. The late Clay Christensen, very famous HBS, who talked a lot about happiness and how to build a successful life. I think there's a lot of what we talked about that I think resonated a lot with me in that book. And I jotted down some points so that is really have purpose in what you're doing. Don't go do a job. You have the opportunity to get into banking is that you've had a successful education. You've had some optionality in terms of what you can do in your career. So tell yourself you have skills, you have some ability to try to do something bigger. So have purpose. If you're working in a team, how can you help contribute to that team and try to do something more ambitious with that team? If you like a certain type of business, how can you build that business? Always think big picture, right? And try to carry people with you in doing that, because this business is a team sport. There's a lot of type A players on the team, but it is a team sport. And really having that purpose is what really brings everybody together. The other topics we talked about, allocating time towards your priorities. And Clay talks a lot about personal life, family life. These are long-term goals, and it's hard to measure things along the way, but you need to be consistently allocating time to your personal life to build those authentic relationships that really matter. And I like reminding myself that every day and having people remind me every day, because we often lose sight of that, especially in finance, where we're all super busy at work. And that's really important to be able to allocate time to certain priorities. And you need to make your priorities. They just don't fall from the sky. Priorities are not things that just pop up last minute and that are urgent. Priorities are, to some extent, things that you plan ahead of time. And so those are really some of the points. Maybe one last one is don't compromise on your values. I think for short-term gain, certainly your values are what drives you, right? In terms of pursuing a purpose, trying to build something, trying to build a team, trying to build a business, you need to have a strong set of values, and people need to trust that you're going to abide by those values. So I think that's really important. That book provides a great foundation of how to think about, I would say, building a successful career and building a successful life. And it's good to read it every year, probably. There's always a new approach or a new thing that you'll think about when you read that book at different moments of your life.
Thanks. I've not heard of that book. I'm not big on philosophy, if I'm honest with you, but it definitely resonates with me, and I can see how it's impacted you. And now you're mentioning it, the rap, I can see how it's had an impact throughout your career and how you've led it and what you've achieved. So I'll definitely get a hands-on copy and we'll share it with the audience too. What a way to end today's episode. Alex, it's been a pleasure. It really has. I really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy year end and getting the CMD with the growth that's been going on. So thanks for taking time out of your schedule to spend it with me and help our listeners grow. Appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Pete. Thanks for the time, all the work you've put into this interview. And you've been doing a great job as well building your firm. And really, it's always a pleasure to see people like you really excited about what they're building and thinking ahead about 2020.
Take care.
Take care, Pete.
This episode was brought to you by Altrum, the global leaders in the financial deal gift, awards and recognition space. So if you need any assistance in these areas, don't be afraid to hit me or the team up. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, best of luck on your growth journey.